Yo, what's up, Sci Fam? It's your boy Nickel here, and today in this page we're going to be learning about the respiratory and circulatory systems. So when you respire, it means that you're breathing, and when you have circulation, it means that your blood is flowing. So we're looking at the breathing and the blood flow through our body here today. So to begin with here, make sure that you set your notebook up like this page right here. So it's titled Respiratory and Circulatory Systems. We're going to define the respiratory system, the circulatory system. We'll draw a picture and we'll talk about the lungs and the heart, which are some of the most important organs for the respiratory and circulatory systems. So to begin with, our respiratory system has two main functions. And the first function of the respiratory system, the first reason we breathe, is to transport oxygen that we get from the air, to transport that oxygen into our blood. And we do that by taking a breath in through our mouths. It goes down into our lungs. That oxygen sits in our lungs and actually transfers into the blood. And then another reason is we exhale, and when we exhale, we actually release carbon dioxide that accumulates in our lungs from our blood. Our blood actually transfers the carbon dioxide into our lungs. And so when we breathe in, we pull oxygen in. The oxygen attaches to the blood. When we breathe out, when the blood actually drops off carbon dioxide in our lungs, and we exhale that carbon dioxide. So the respiratory system is basically the way that we get air into and out of our lungs. When we pull it in, we use the oxygen, and when we breathe out, we get rid of that waste, which is carbon dioxide. Now, the circulatory system has two functions as well. And the main purpose of the circulatory system is to transports blood to every cell in the body. Now, this is important because every single cell needs nutrients and oxygen, and it has to get rid of their waste. So the circulatory system, it transports blood to every cell in the body to do two things. First, to deliver the nutrients and the oxygen. And it delivers that to every single cell. Every cell needs nutrients and oxygen. And then every cell actually produces waste as it uses the machinery inside of the cell that we call those organelles. When those organelles do work, especially in the mitochondria where cellular respiration happens, CO2 is a waste product. So the second function of a circulatory system is to gather and remove waste. And we'll learn more about how the circulatory system and respiratory system work together. And the red blood cells, which are part of the circulatory system, work with the respiratory system in order to achieve all of these functions. So what you need to do is you need to pause the video and you need to draw yourself a head here off to the side. And make sure that the mouth is open, because what we're going to do here is we're going to do a dashed line to show that there's a nasal cavity that we have. In the back of our throat, our nasal cavity connects with our mouth cavity. And both of those can be used in order to take a breath and to get things into our throat. Now, our throat actually splits into two different pathways. This pathway here that doesn't have an end to it, this one actually goes down into our stomach. We call this our esophagus. So make sure you label this after you get it drawn. And our esophagus is basically, a simple way to talk about it is calling it our food tube. So when you eat something, it goes down your esophagus. You wouldn't want it to go into your lungs. And so our body is able to detect that we are eating food and the food goes down our esophagus. But when we take a breath, it goes down this tube here. And this tube is what we would call our larynx. And your larynx, that's a good Scrabble word if you're ever playing. Larynx is essentially our air tube. Since we call the other one our food tube, let's call this one our air tube. And so when we take a breath, the air comes in and it goes down our larynx. And it then meets this fork in the road. And this fork in the road, let's draw some arrows here. Let's get it so that they kind of are the same thing. This area where it splits into two different pathways, these are called our bronchi. Since there's two of them, we call them bronchi. And if you've ever had bronchitis, it's these tubes that get inflamed. And you probably had some chest pain because these tubes actually enter into our lungs. And so these dashed lines here are actually there to show us our lungs. And so let's label our lungs. This red thing here in the middle, this is our heart. And our heart actually sits here between our lungs. And this is important because our heart and our lungs work together in order to allow the circulatory and respiratory system to achieve their duty and their job. Now, let's go back to those bronchi, because those bronchi enter our lungs, but those are so big that they allow a lot of air to be transferred. But in order to get the air into our blood, these have to get smaller so that they can be the size of a blood cell. So our bronchi actually split into multiple tubes here, and then these tubes split into multiple tubes. And then these tubes split into multiple tubes. So basically it's like a fractal, or an object that as you zoom in more and more, it gets more and more fine. And that happens on both sides here. So it just keeps on branching. And again, it gets so small that it creates these little sacs that are just one cell thick. It's kind of like the veins and arteries in our body. They're big in some places, but as they get closer and closer to actual cells, they have to branch off into these little branches to transfer the energy. All right, so this is just an introduction into our lungs and heart and our throat and our whole respiratory and circulatory system. So these are some of the most important things to know, is that we have a separate tube for air compared to food, that larynx splits into two different pipes called our bronchi that enter each of our lungs, and our lungs sit on either side of our heart. Our heart is kind of seated there in the middle. So let's talk about our lungs real quick, and let's record some important information. Lungs are not a muscle. Now this is important because our lungs can't expand and contract on their own. If they're a muscle, maybe they could, but they're not a muscle, so they can't. They need this thing here. It's a weird word called our diaphragm. It's a muscle that sits below our lungs, and the diaphragm, they need this. They need the diaphragm to expand and compress the lungs. So our lungs can't do it on their own. A muscle below our lungs actually opens our chest, and when it does, our lungs get bigger and they suck in the air, and then the muscle contracts and it gets smaller and it closes our chest wall, and then that's how we allow pressure to be forced onto our lungs, which pushes air out of our lungs. Now this is different than the heart, because our heart is actually primarily a muscle. That's why we want to do aerobic exercises like those HIIT workouts, is that our heart is a muscle, so we need to make sure that we're working that muscle. So it is a muscle, and it pumps blood into our lungs. That's right. It actually forces blood to go into our lungs to meet up with these little tiny air tubes here, so that the blood can get air, and it can get the oxygen, and then it can drop off the carbon dioxide. We'll talk more about in our next science notebook page. But the heart is a muscle. It pumps blood into our lungs and through our body. So the heart is really important because it not only circulates our blood throughout our whole body and gets blood to every cell in our body, but it also forces that blood to go inside of our lungs where it gets the oxygen, which is important because one of the purposes of the circulatory system is to deliver oxygen and remove waste, and one of the purposes of the respiratory system is to transport oxygen into our blood and release carbon dioxide from the blood. So the heart and the lungs must work together. All right, now you know. And now you're a little bit smarter. I'll see you on the next page.